The first step is to download your pattern. Select your file according to your paper format and the size you wish to make. Print your pattern at 100% scale. There is a scale test included on the first page of your pattern to ensure you have printed correctly. Trim around the thin black border and use clear sticky tape to stick the pages together. There is a layout included in the instruction guide to help you lay out all the pages correctly. Trim around each individual pattern piece and lay the pattern onto the fabric. You can follow the cutting layout included in the instructions to make the most economical use of your fabric. Cut according to the individual instructions marked on each of the pieces. This pattern calls for woven fusible interfacing for the hem facings, but if your fabric is particularly thick, you may not wish to include this. Also, there is the optional use of 25mm or 1" wide contrast trim for this style. If you wish, you can create your own using 25mm strips or 1" strips cut on the bias. Overlock the outer curved edge of each of the pocket bags. There are 4 in total. Place the pocket bag onto the side seam of the front piece between the notches. The right sides should be touching one another. Stitch along the edge using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and repeat for the other side of the fronts. Repeat this for the back pieces, placing the pocket bag along the side seam between the notches and stitching in place. Overlock each of the side seams separately. You'll be catching the edge of the pocket bag into the overlocking. Repeat for all 4 side seams, 2 front pieces and 2 back pieces. Press the pocket open along the seam. The seam allowance should be pressed towards the pocket bag. Understitch along the pocket edge. You will be creating a narrow stitch along the seam on the pocket bag side 3mm or 1/8 of an inch from the seam edge. Place the front piece on top of the back piece, matching the pocket bags together and along the side seam. Stitch from the top edge of the pocket bag around the curved edge to the point level with the notch along the pocket edge. Pivot your stitching to continue stitching down the side seam. Repeat this for the other side so that you have a pair for each side of your legs. Once you've done this for both sides, open out the front and the back piece. Align the side seams together and position the top edge of the pocket along the top edge of the waist on the front piece. Pin in place and use the sewing machine to secure the top edge of the pocket in place. The pocket should now be closed with the front and back side seams meeting together and touching one another. Match the short inner seam of the shorts together. The right sides should be touching one another. Stitch the seam using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock the seam and then repeat for the other leg so that you have a pair. Once both sides of the legs are done, turn one pair through to the right side and place it inside the other. Match along the crotch seams, matching from the front curve all the way through to the back curve. The right sides should be touching one another. Pin in place and stitch using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock the seam, then turn the garment through to the right side. Take one of the front hem facing pieces and match it to the back hem facing piece at the side seam. You'll notice there is an extra notch on the side seam of the hem facing. This is to indicate the notches match the side seams together. The right sides should be touching one another. Pin in place and stitch using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seam open and repeat for the other pair of hem facings. For this style, you can use pre-cut bias trim that is 25mm in width, or you can cut your own 25mm strips on the bias. Just make sure the strips are long enough to go along the top edge of the front and back hem facings. Alternatively, you can make this style without any trim at all if you would prefer. If you are using the contrast trim, fold the trim piece in half and give it a really good press along the edge. The right sides should be together. Match the raw edges of the trim to the raw edge of the top edge of the hem facing. The trim should be placed onto the right side of the hem facing. Stitch the trim along the top edge using a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open out the trim and press it upwards. The seam allowance for the trim should be going downwards in the direction of the main hem facing. Repeat for both sets of the hem facings so that you have a pair. Fold the hem facing in half with the right sides touching one another, matching along the short inner seam. Stitch together using a 1cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat for both sides so that you have a pair. Match the hem facing to the hem of the shorts. The bottom edge of the hem facing should be along the bottom edge of the main shorts, with the right side of the hem facing matching the wrong side of the main shorts. Pin the hem facing in place and stitch along the bottom edge using a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open out the hem facing and press along the seam with the iron. The seam allowance should be pressed upwards towards the main shorts. Understitch the seam hem facing, stitching 3mm or 1/8 inch from the seam on the main short side of the seam. Press the hem facing upwards to the right side of the shorts, pressing sharply along the hem edge. Pin the hem facing in place. Stitch the hem facing in place by stitching 3mm or 1/8 inch below the seam of the trim and the facing. Stitch all the way through to secure the hem facing to the main shorts. Place the waistband pieces together with the right sides touching one another. Stitch along the short edge using a 1cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. There is no need to overlock this seam on either side. Repeat for both of the short edges so the waistband is in one continuous band. Fold the waistband piece in half lengthways. The wrong sides should be together touching one another. Press well along the folded edge. Then, match the waistband piece to the waist edge of the main shorts. All the raw edges should be aligned along the top edge. The seam of the waistband should align with the side seams of the main shorts. Stitch around the waistband edge using a 1cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Leave a 7.5 cm or 3 inch opening at the centre back so that the elastic can be inserted. Create a second row of stitching 2.5 cm or 1 inch below the top edge of the waistband. Also leave a 7.5 cm or 3 inch opening at the centre back. Cut 2 pieces of elastic to the appropriate length for the size you are making. The lengths per size are listed in the instruction guide, although you may need to adjust these lengths if you have a particularly firm or soft elastic. Attach your safety pin to one end of your elastic pieces. Use the safety pin to thread the elastic through the upper opening of the waistband. Once you've threaded the elastic all the way through, Overlap the elastic by 2 cm and use the sewing machine to secure the ends together to create a continuous loop of elastic. Close off the upper opening by connecting the stitching between the 7.5 cm or 3-inch opening. Stretch out the elastic so the waistband sits flat, and then stitch the opening closed, closing up the existing stitch line. Attach the safety pin to the remaining piece of elastic. Thread it through the lower channel of the waistband. Once the elastic is threaded all the way through, overlap the elastic by 2 cm and use the sewing machine to secure the ends together to create a continuous loop of elastic. Stitch the waistband opening closed. Stretch out the elastic and use a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to stitch the 7.5 cm or 3-inch opening closed. Overlock the waistband seam to create a nice, neat internal finish. You'll have to stretch out the elastic as you overlock. And then you're all done.